American Government, Institutions and Policies, 14th edition, by James Q. Wilson, John J. DeLulio Jr., and Mina Bose. Part 1. The American System. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. Federalist No. 51. Chapter 1. The Study of American Government. Learning Objectives. 1. What is meant by politics? 2. Can you give 2 definitions of democracy? 3. How is political power actually distributed in America? 4. What is the political agenda and why has it expanded? 5. How can you classify and explain the politics of different issues? Today, Americans and their elected leaders are hotly debating the federal government's spending, taxing, and future finances. Some things never change. Then, in 1786, a committee of Congress reported that since the Articles of Confederation were adopted in 1781, the state governments had paid only about 1/7 of the monies requisitioned by the federal government. The federal government was broke and sinking deeper into debt, including debt owed to foreign governments. Several states had financial crises, too. In 1788, the proposed Constitution's chief architect, James Madison, argued that while the federal government needed its own power of taxation and collectors of revenue, its overall powers would remain few and defined, and its taxing power would be used sparingly. In reply, critics of that proposed Constitution, including the famous patriot Patrick Henry, mocked Madison's view and predicted that if the Constitution were ratified, there would over time be an immense increase of taxes spent by an ever-growing federal government. Now, in 2010, a bipartisan presidential commission warned that by 2015, the federal government would be paying well over $300 billion a year in interest on a roughly $20 trillion national debt, much of it borrowed from foreign nations. The federal budget, initially proposed for 2014, called for spending about $3.8 trillion, roughly a fifth of it in deficit spending. Projected total state and local government spending for 2014 was about $3.2 trillion, including federal grants, and many states and cities' finances were in shambles. So, in the 1780s, as in the 2010s, nearly everyone agreed that government's finances were a huge mess and that bold action was required, and soon. But in each case, then and now, there was no consensus about what action to take or when. Issues and politics. This might seem odd. After all, it may appear that the government's financial problems, including big budget deficits and revenue shortfalls, could be solved by simple arithmetic. Either spend and borrow less, or tax more, or both. But now ask, spend or borrow less for what, and raise taxes on whom, when, how, and by how much? For example, should we cut the defense budget but continue to fund healthcare programs, or the reverse? Or should we keep defense and healthcare funding at current levels, but reduce spending on environmental protection or homeland security? Should we perhaps increase taxes on the wealthy, define wealthy, and cut taxes for the middle class, define middle class? Or what? Then, as now, the fundamental government finance problems were political, not mathematical. People disagreed not only over how much the federal government should tax and spend, but also over whether it should involve itself at all in various endeavors. For example, in 2011, the federal government nearly shut down, not mainly over disagreements between the two parties about how much needed to be cut from the federal budget. In the end, the agreed-to cuts totaled $38.5 billion, but primarily over whether any federal funding at all should go to certain relatively small-budget federal health, environmental, and other programs. Fights over taxes and government finances, battles over abortion, school prayer, and gay rights, disputes about where to store nuclear waste, competing plans on immigration, international trade, welfare reform, environmental protection, or gun control, contention surrounding a new healthcare proposal. Some of these matters are mainly about money and economic interests, others are more about ideas and personal beliefs. Some people care a lot about at least some of these matters, others seem to care little or not at all. Regardless, all such matters and countless others have this in common. Each is an issue, defined as a conflict, real or apparent, between the interests, ideas, or beliefs of different citizens. An issue may be more apparent than real. For example, people might fight over two tax plans that, despite superficial differences, would actually distribute tax burdens on different groups in exactly the same way. Or an issue may be as real as it seems to the conflicting parties, as, for example, it is in matters that pose clear-cut choices, high tariffs or no tariffs, abortion legal in all cases or illegal in all cases. And an issue might be more about conflicts over means than over ends. For example, on healthcare reform or other issues, legislators who are in the same party and have similar ideological leanings, like a group of liberal Democrats or a group of conservative Republicans, might agree on objectives but still wrangle bitterly with each other over different means of achieving their goals. Or they might agree on both ends and means, but differ over priorities, which goals to pursue first, timing, when to proceed, or tactics, how to proceed. Whatever form issues take, they are the raw materials of politics. By politics, we mean the activity, negotiation, argument, discussion, application of force, persuasion, etc., by which an issue is agitated or settled. There are many different ways that any given issue can be agitated, brought to attention, stimulate conflict, or settled, brought to an accommodation, stimulate consensus. And there are many different ways that government can agitate or settle, foster, or frustrate political conflict. This is a good time to ask yourself, what, if any, issues matter to you? Generally speaking, do you care a lot, a little, or not at all about economic issues, social issues, or issues involving foreign policy or military affairs? Do you follow any particular ongoing debates on issues like tightening gun control laws, expanding healthcare insurance, regulating immigration, or funding anti-poverty programs? As you will learn in Part 2 of this textbook, some citizens are quite issue-oriented and politically active. They vote and try to influence others to vote likewise. They join political campaigns or give money to candidates. They keep informed about diverse issues, sign petitions, advocate for new laws, or communicate with elected leaders, and more. But such politically attentive and engaged citizens are the exception to the rule, most especially among young adult citizens under the age of 30. According to many experts, ever more young Americans are closer to being political dropouts than they are to being engaged citizens, a fact that is made no less troubling by similar trends in the United Kingdom, Canada, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. Many high school and college students believe getting involved in our democracy means volunteering for community service, but not voting. Most young Americans do not regularly read newspapers, online or otherwise, or closely follow political news, and most know little about how government works and exhibit no regular interest in politics. In response to such concerns, various analysts and study commissions have made proposals ranging from compulsory voting to enhanced civic education in high schools. The fact that you are reading this textbook tells us that you probably have some interest in American politics and government. To help enliven that interest as you learn more about this subject, each chapter in parts 1 through 3 of this textbook contains a feature, What's Your Issue?, that encourages you to explore present-day debates over a particular issue. Power, authority, and legitimacy. Politics, and the processes by which issues are normally agitated or settled, involves the exercise of power. By power, we mean the ability of one person to get another person to act in accordance with the first person's intentions. Sometimes an exercise of power is obvious, as when the president tells the Air Force that it cannot build a new bomber or orders soldiers into combat in a foreign land. Other times, an exercise of power is subtle, as when the president's junior speechwriters, reflecting their own evolving views, adopt a new tone when writing for their boss about controversial social issues, like abortion. The speechwriters may not think they are using power, after all, they are the president's subordinates and may rarely see him face to face, but if the president lets their words exit his mouth in public, they have used power. Power is found in all human relationships, but we shall be concerned here only with power as it is used to affect who will hold government office and how government will behave. We limit our view here to government, and chiefly to the American federal government. However, we shall repeatedly pay special attention to how things once thought to be private matters become public, that is, how they manage to become objects of governmental action. Indeed, as we will discuss more below, one of the most striking transformations of American politics has been the extent to which, in recent decades, almost every aspect of human life has found its way onto the political agenda. People who exercise political power may or may not have the authority to do so. By authority, we mean the right to use power. The exercise of rightful power, that is, of authority, is ordinarily easier than the exercise of power not supported by any persuasive claim of right. We accept decisions, often without question, if they are made by people who we believe have the right to make them. We may bow to naked power because we cannot resist it, but by our recalcitrance or our resentment, we put the users of naked power to greater trouble than the wielders of authority. In this book, we will on occasion speak of formal authority. By this, we mean that the right to exercise power is vested in a governmental office. A president, a senator, and a federal judge have formal authority to take certain actions. What makes power rightful varies from time to time and from country to country. In the United States, we usually say a person has political authority if his or her right to act in a certain way is conferred by a law or by a state or national constitution. But what makes law or constitution a source of right? That is the question of legitimacy. In the United States, the Constitution today is widely, if not unanimously, accepted as a source of legitimate authority, but that was not always the case. What's your issue? Medicare reform. There are two basic questions to ask oneself about any given issue. 1. What's my stake in the issue? For instance, if you or people you care about are in college or headed for college, and if you or they rely on government-backed college loans to pay tuition bills, then you might perceive yourself as having a stake in the fate of proposals to cut or expand college loans. Perceiving your stake in the issue, you might pay attention to whether these proposals attract public support, gain legislative sponsors, and become laws. Do you think you have a stake in this issue, and if so, what is it? 2. What's my take on the issue? But even if you perceive no economic, personal, or other stake in an issue, you might yet have a take on the issue. For example, you might believe that in order to reduce socioeconomic inequalities, or to ensure that America has a highly educated, globally competitive workforce, or for what you consider to be purely moral reasons, you would favor expanding, or oppose cutting, government-backed college loans. Do you have a take on this issue, and if so, what is it? Figuring out whether, or by what definition, you have a stake, direct or indirect, in any given issue, and deciding what, in any case, is your take on the same issue, can be illuminating, self-revealing, and, dare we political junkies add, even fun. For one thing, you will, we hope, not only think more, but learn more and think more deeply about many different issues, including issues about which you already have opinions or know more than just a little. And, in more than a few cases, you may discover that you have both a stake in and a take on an issue about which you previously knew little and cared less. For instance, take Medicare, the program that pays for part of the cost of medical care for retired or disabled people. The program is financed mainly by payroll taxes on employees and employers. So, what's your issue with Medicare? You might not be elderly, retired, disabled, an employee, or an employer, not at present anyway. But decisions about the program's future are likely to affect you and people you care about. Plenty. And the issue involves many fundamental moral and value choices, including ones about government's present and future role in financing and administering healthcare. To wit, Medicare cost nearly $600 billion in 2013, and it is projected to cost more than $1 trillion by 2022. The program's trustees announced in 2011 that it would become insolvent by 2017. Since then, no fewer than a dozen proposals have been made by various members of Congress, by the White House, and by various blue ribbon commissions to ensure the program's long-term solvency. But some plans get there by raising taxes on all recipients, including young ones, and cutting benefits or just future benefits. Others get there mainly by raising taxes on the wealthiest recipients, or by raising the eligibility age from 65 to 69 or 70, or by various other means. And some proposals would replace Medicare with a premium support or voucher program. At present, no one Medicare reform plan has both wide and deep public support. Got a stake, a take, or a proposal on the issue? If you're using the full version of this book with separate policy chapters, hold on. You will revisit this issue in Chapter 17. What is democracy? On one matter, virtually all Americans seem to agree. No exercise of political power by government at any level is legitimate if it is not in some sense democratic. That wasn't always the prevailing view. In 1787, as the Constitution was being debated, Alexander Hamilton worried that the new government he helped create might be too democratic, while George Mason, who refused to sign the Constitution, worried that it was not democratic enough. Today, however, almost everyone believes that democratic government is the only proper kind. Most people believe that American government is democratic. Some believe that other institutions of public life, schools, universities, corporations, trade unions, churches, also should be run on democratic principles if they are to be legitimate, and some insist that promoting democracy abroad ought to be a primary purpose of U.S. foreign policy. Democracy is a word with at least two different meanings. First, the term democracy is used to describe those regimes that come as close as possible to Aristotle's definition, the rule of the many. A government is democratic if all or most of its citizens participate directly in either holding office or making policy. This often is called direct or participatory democracy. In Aristotle's time, Greece in the 4th century BC, such a government was possible. The Greek city-state, or polis, was quite small, and within it, citizenship was extended to all free adult male property holders. Slaves, women, minors, and those without property were excluded from participation in government. In more recent times, the New England town meeting approximates the Aristotelian ideal. In such a meeting, the adult citizens of a community gather once or twice a year to vote directly on all major issues and expenditures of the town. As towns have become larger and issues more complicated, many town governments have abandoned the pure town meeting in favor of either the representative town meeting, in which a large number of elected representatives, perhaps 200 to 300, meet to vote on town affairs, or representative government, in which a small number of elected city councilors make decisions. The second definition of democracy is the principle of governance of most nations that are called democratic. It was most concisely stated by the economist Joseph Schumpeter. The democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals, that is, leaders, acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Sometimes this method is called, approvingly, representative democracy. At other times, it is referred to, disapprovingly, as the elitist theory of democracy. It is justified by one or both of two arguments. First, it is impractical, owing to limits of time, information, energy, interest, and expertise, for the people to decide on public policy. But it is not impractical to expect them to make reasonable choices among competing leadership groups. Second, some people, including, as we shall see in the next chapter, many of the framers of the Constitution, believe direct democracy is likely to lead to bad decisions, because people often decide large issues on the basis of fleeting passions and in response to popular demagogues. This concern about direct democracy persists today, as evidenced by the statements of leaders who disagree with voter decisions. For example, voters in many states have rejected referenda that would have increased public funding for private schools. Politicians who opposed the defeated referenda spoke approvingly of the, quote, will of the people, but politicians who favored them spoke disdainfully of, quote, mass misunderstanding. Whenever we refer to that form of democracy involving the direct participation of all or most citizens, we shall use the term direct or participatory democracy. Whenever the word democracy is used alone in this book, it will have the meaning Schumpeter gave it. Schumpeter's definition usefully implies basic benchmarks that enable us to judge the extent to which any given political system is democratic. A political system is non-democratic to the extent that it denies equal voting rights to part of its society, and severely limits or outright prohibits, quote, the civil and political freedoms to speak, publish, assemble, and organize, all of which are necessary to a truly, quote, competitive struggle for the people's vote. A partial list of non-democratic political systems would include absolute monarchies, empires, military dictatorships, authoritarian systems, and totalitarian states. Scholars of comparative politics and government have much to teach about how different types of political systems, democratic and non-democratic, arise, persist, and change. For our present purposes, however, it is most important to understand that America itself was once far less democratic than it is today, and that it was so not by accident, but by design. As we discuss in the next chapter, the men who wrote the Constitution did not use the word democracy in that document. They wrote instead of a, quote, republican form of government, but by that they meant what we call representative democracy. And, as we emphasize when discussing civil liberties and civil rights, see Chapter 5 and 6, and again when discussing political participation, see Chapter 8, America was not born as a full-fledged representative democracy, and, for all the progress of the past half-century or so, the nation's representative democratic character is still very much a work in progress. For any representative democracy to work, there must of course be an opportunity for genuine leadership competition. This requires, in turn, that individuals and parties be able to run for office, that communications, through speeches or the press, in meetings and on the internet, be free, and that the voters perceive that a meaningful choice exists. But what exactly constitutes a meaningful choice? How many offices should be elective, and how many appointive? How many candidates or parties can exist before the choices become hopelessly confused? Where will the money come from to finance electoral campaigns? There are many answers to such questions. In some European democracies, for example, very few offices, often just those in the national or local legislature, are elective, and much of the money for campaigning for these offices comes from the government. In the United States, many offices, executive and judicial as well as legislative, are elective, and most of the money the candidates use for campaigning comes from the industry, labor unions, and private individuals. Some people have argued that the virtues of direct or participatory democracy can and should be reclaimed, even in a modern, complex society. This can be done either by allowing individual neighborhoods in big cities to govern themselves, aka community control, or by requiring those affected by some government program to participate in its formulation, aka citizen participation. In many states, a measure of direct democracy exists when voters can decide on referendum issues, that is, policy choices that appear on the ballot. The proponents of direct democracy defend it as the only way to ensure that the will of the people prevails. As we discuss in the nearby Constitutional Connections feature, and as we explore more in Chapter 2, the framers of the Constitution did not think that the will of the people was synonymous with the common interest or the public good. They strongly favored representative democracy over direct democracy. Political power in America. 5 views. Scholars differ in their interpretations of the American political experience. Where some see a steady march of democracy, others see no such thing, where some emphasize how voting and other rights have been steadily expanded. Others stress how they were denied to so many for so long and so forth. Short of attempting to reconcile these competing historical interpretations, let us step back now for a moment to our definition of representative democracy and 5 competing views about how political power has been distributed in America. Representative democracy is defined as any system of government in which leaders are authorized to make decisions and thereby to wield political power by winning a competitive struggle for the popular vote. It is obvious that very different sets of hands can control political power, depending on what kinds of people can become leaders, how the struggle for votes is carried on, how much freedom to act is given to those who win the struggle, and what other sorts of influence, besides the desire for popular approval, affect the leader's actions. The actual distribution of political power in a representative democracy will depend on the composition of the political elites who are involved in the struggles of power and over policy. By elite, we mean an identifiable group of persons who possess a disproportionate share of some valued resource, in this case, political power. There are at least 5 views about how political power is distributed in America. 1. Wealthy capitalists and other economic elites determine most policies. 2. A group of business, military, labor union, and elected officials controls most decisions. 3. Appointed bureaucrats ultimately run everything. 4. Representatives and a large number of interest groups are in charge. And 5. Morally impassioned elites drive political change. The first view began with the theories of Karl Marx, who, in the 19th century, argued that governments were dominated by business owners, the bourgeoisie, until a revolution replaced them with rule by laborers, the proletariat. But strict Marxism has collapsed in most countries. Today, a class view, though it may derive inspiration from Marx, is less dogmatic and emphasizes the power of the rich, or the leaders of multinational corporations. The second view ties business leaders together with other elites whose perceived power is of concern to the view's adherents. These elites may include top military officials, labor union leaders, mass media executives, and the heads of a few special interest groups. Derived from the work of sociologist C. Wright Mills, the power elite view argues that American democracy is dominated by a few top leaders, many of them wealthy or privately powerful, who do not hold elective office. The third view is that appointed officials run everything, despite the efforts of elected officials and the public to control them. The bureaucratic view was first set forth by the German scholar Max Weber. He argued that the modern state, in order to become successful, puts its affairs in the hands of appointed bureaucrats, whose competence is essential to the management of complex affairs. These officials, invisible to most people, have mastered the written records and legislative details of the government, and do more than just implement democratic policies. They actually make those policies. The fourth view holds that political resources, such as money, prestige, expertise, and access to the mass media, have become so widely distributed that no single elite, no social class, no bureaucratic arrangement can control them. Many 20th century political scientists, among them David B. Truman, adopted a pluralist view. In the United States, they argued, political resources are broadly shared in part because there are so many governmental institutions, cities, states, school boards, and so many rival institutions, legislatures, executives, judges, bureaucrats, that no single group can dominate most or even much of the political process. The fifth view maintains that while each of the other four views is correct with respect to how power is distributed on certain issues or during political business-as-usual periods, each also misses how the most important policy decisions and political changes are influenced by morally impassioned elites who are motivated less by economic self-interest than they are by an almost religious zeal to bring government institutions and policies into the line with democratic ideals. Samuel P. Huntington articulated this creedal passion view, offering the examples of Patrick Henry and the revolutionaries of the 1770s, the advocates of Jackson-style democracy in the 1820s, the progressive reformers of the early 20th century, and the leaders of the civil rights and anti-war movements in the mid-20th century. Constitutional connections, deciding what's legitimate. Much of American political history has been a struggle over what constitutes legitimate authority. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 was an effort to see whether a new, more powerful federal government could be made legitimate. The succeeding administrations of George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson were in large measure preoccupied with disputes over the kinds of decisions that were legitimate for the federal government to make. The Civil War was a bloody struggle over slavery and the legitimacy of the federal union. The New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt was hotly debated by those who disagreed over whether it was legitimate for the federal government to intervene deeply in the economy. Not uncommonly, the federal judiciary functions as the ultimate arbiter of what is legitimate in the context of deciding what is or is not constitutional. See Chapter 16. For instance, in 2012, amidst a contentious debate over the legitimacy of the federal healthcare law that was enacted in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the federal government could require individuals to purchase health insurance, but could not require states to expand healthcare benefits for citizens participating in the federal state program known as Medicaid. Who governs, and to what ends? So, which view is correct? At one level, all are correct, at least in part. Economic class interests, powerful cadres of elites, entrenched bureaucrats, competing pressure groups, and morally impassioned individuals have all at one time or another wielded political power and played a part in shaping our government and its policies. But, more fundamentally, understanding any political system means being able to give reasonable answers to each of two separate but related questions about it. Who governs, and to what ends? We want to know the answer to the first question because we believe that those who rule, their personalities and beliefs, their virtues and vices, will affect what they do to and for us. Many people think they already know the answer to this question, and they are prepared to talk and vote on that basis. That is their right, and the opinions they express may be correct. But they also may be wrong. Indeed, many of these opinions must be wrong because they are in conflict. When asked who governs, some people will say the unions, and some will say big business. Others will say the politicians, the people, or the special interests. Still others will say Wall Street, the military, crackpot liberals, the media, the bureaucrats, or white males. Not all of these answers can be correct, at least not all of the time. The answer to the second question is important because it tells us how government affects our lives. We want to know not only who governs, but what difference it makes who governs. In our day-to-day lives, we may not think government makes much difference at all. In one sense, that is right, because our most pressing personal concerns, work, play, love, family, health, essentially are private matters on which government touches but slightly. But in a larger and longer perspective, government makes a substantial difference. Consider, in 1935, 96% of all American families paid no federal income tax. And for the 4% or so who did pay, the average rate was only about 4% of their income. Today, almost all families pay federal payroll taxes, and the average rate is about 21% of their incomes. Or consider, in 1960, in many parts of the country, African Americans could ride only in the backs of buses, had to use washrooms and drinking fountains that were labeled colored, and could not be served in most public restaurants. Such restrictions have almost all been eliminated, in large part because of decisions by the federal government. It is important to bear in mind that we wish to answer two different questions, and not two versions of the same question. You cannot always predict what goals government will establish by knowing only who governs, nor can you always tell who governs by knowing what activities government undertakes. Most people holding national political office are middle-class, middle-aged, white Protestant males, but we cannot then conclude that the government will adopt only policies that are to the narrow advantage of the middle class, the middle-aged, whites, Protestants, or men. If we thought that, we would be at a loss to explain why the rich are taxed more heavily than the poor, why the war on poverty was declared, why constitutional amendments giving rights to African Americans and women passed Congress by large majorities, or why Catholics and Jews have been appointed to so many important governmental posts. This book is chiefly devoted to answering the question, who governs? It is written in the belief that this question cannot be answered without looking at how government makes, or fails to make, decisions about a large variety of concrete issues. Thus, in this book, we shall inspect government policies to see what individuals, groups, and institutions seem to exert the greatest power in the continuous struggle to define the purposes of government. How we compare. Academic freedom. You are reading a textbook on American government, but how is the freedom to study, teach, or do research protected from undue government interference? And how do European democracies protect academic freedom? The U.S. Constitution does not mention academic freedom. Rather, in America, the federal and state courts have typically treated academic freedom, at least in tax-supported universities, as free speech strongly protected under the First Amendment. In each of 9 European nations, the Constitution is silent on academic freedom, but various national laws protect it. In 13 other European nations, academic freedom is protected both by explicit constitutional language and by national legislation. But is academic freedom better protected in these nations than in either the United States or elsewhere in Europe? Not necessarily. Germany's constitution states that research and teaching are free, but subject to loyalty to the Constitution. Italy's constitution offers lavish protections for academic freedom, but its national laws severely restrict those same freedoms. The United Kingdom has no written constitution, but its national laws regarding academic freedom and university self-governance are quite restrictive by American standards. Expanding the political agenda. No matter who governs, the most important decision that affects policymaking is also the least noticed one, deciding what to make policy about, or in the language of political science, deciding what belongs on the political agenda. The political agenda consists of issues that people believe require governmental action. We take for granted that politics is about certain familiar issues such as taxes, energy, welfare, civil rights, and homeland security. We forget that there is nothing inevitable about having these issues, rather than some other ones, on the nation's political agenda. For example, at one time it was unconstitutional for the federal government to levy income taxes. Energy was a non-issue because everyone, or at least everyone who could chop down trees for firewood, had enough. Welfare was something for cities and towns to handle. Civil rights were supposed to be a matter of private choice rather than government action. Homeland Security was not in the political lexicon, and a huge federal cabinet department by that name was nowhere on the horizon. At any given time, what is on the political agenda is affected by at least 4 things. Shared political values. For example, if people believe that poverty is the result of social forces rather than individual choices, then there is a reason to enact or expand government programs to combat poverty. The weight of custom and tradition. People will usually accept what the government has customarily done, even if they are leery of what it proposes to do. The impact of events such as wars, terrorist attacks, and severe or sustained economic downturns alters our sense of the proper role of government. Changes in the way political elites think and talk about politics. Because many people believe that whatever the government now does, it ought to continue doing, and because changes in attitudes and the impact of events tend to increase the number of things that government does, the political agenda is always growing larger. Thus, today, there are far fewer debates about the legitimacy of a proposed government policy than there were in the 1920s or 1930s. For instance, in the 1930s, when what became the Social Security program was first proposed, the debate was largely about whether the federal government should have any role whatsoever in providing financial support for elderly or disabled citizens. In stark contrast, today, not a single member of Congress denies that the federal government should have a major role in providing financial support for elderly or disabled citizens, or advocates ending Social Security. Instead, today's debates about the program are largely over competing plans to ensure its long-term financial solvency. Popular views regarding what belongs on the political agenda are often changed by the impact of events. During wartime, or after a terrorist attack on this country, many people expect the government to do whatever is necessary to win, whether or not such actions are clearly authorized by the Constitution. Economic depressions or deep recessions, such as the ones that began in 1929 and 2007, also lead many people to expect the government to take action. A coal mine disaster leads to an enlarged role for the government in promoting mine safety. A series of airplane hijackings leads to a change in public opinion so great that what once would have been unthinkable, requiring all passengers at airports to be searched before boarding their flights, becomes routine. But sometimes the government enlarges the political agenda, often dramatically, without any crisis or widespread public demand. This may happen even at a time when the conditions at which a policy is directed are improving. For instance, there was no mass public demand for government action to make automobiles safer before 1966, when a law was passed imposing safety standards on cars. Though the number of auto fatalities per 100 million miles driven had gone up slightly just before the law was passed, in the long term, highway deaths had been more or less steadily trending downward. It is not easy to explain why the government adds new issues to its agenda and adopts new programs when there is little public demand, and when, in fact, there has been an improvement in the conditions to which the policies are addressed. In general, the explanation may be found in the behavior of groups, the workings of institutions, the media, and the action of state governments. Groups. Many policies are the result of small groups of people enlarging the scope of government by their demands. Sometimes these are organized interests, for example, corporations or unions. Sometimes they are intense but unorganized groups, such as urban minorities. The organized groups often work quietly behind the scenes. The intense, unorganized ones may take their causes to the streets. For example, organized labor favored a tough federal safety law governing factories and other workplaces, not because it was unaware that factory conditions had been improving, but because the standards by which union leaders and members judged working conditions had risen even faster. As people became better off, conditions that once were thought normal suddenly became intolerable. On occasion, a group expresses in violent ways its dissatisfaction with what it judges to be intolerable conditions. The riots in American cities during the mid-1960s had a variety of causes, and people participated out of a variety of motives. For many, rioting was a way of expressing pent-up anger at what they regarded was an unresponsive and unfair society. a sense of relative deprivation, of being worse off than one thinks one ought to be, helps explain why so large a proportion of the rioters were not uneducated, employed recent migrants to the city, but rather young men and women born in the North, educated in its schools, and employed in its factories. Life under these conditions turned out to be not what they had come to expect or what they were prepared to tolerate. The new demands of such groups need not result in an enlarged political agenda, and they often do not produce such results when society and its governing institutions are confident in the rightness of the existing state of affairs. Unions could have been voted down to the Occupational Safety Bill, rioters could have been jailed and ignored. At one time, this is exactly what would have happened, but society itself had changed. Many people who were not workers sympathized with the plight of the injured worker and distrusted the good intentions of business in this matter. Many well-off citizens felt a constructive, not just a punitive response to the urban riots was required, and thus urged the formation of commissions to study and the passage of laws to deal with the problems of inner-city life. Such changes in the values and beliefs of people generally, or at least of people in key government positions, are an essential part of any explanation of why policies not demanded by public opinion nonetheless become part of the political agenda. Government institutions. Among the institutions whose influence on agenda setting has become especially important are the courts, the bureaucracy, and the Senate. The courts can make decisions that force the hand of the other branches of government. For example, when in 1954 the Supreme Court ordered schools desegregated, Congress and the White House could no longer ignore the issue. Local resistance to implementing the order led President Eisenhower to send troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, despite his dislike for using force against local governments. Similarly, when the Supreme Court ruled in 1973 that the states could not ban abortions during the first trimester of pregnancy, abortion suddenly became a national political issue. Right-to-life activists campaigned to reverse the court's decision, or, failing that, to prevent federal funds from being used to pay for abortions. Pro-choice activists fought to prevent the court from reversing course and to get federal funding for abortions. In these and many other cases, the courts act like tripwires. When activated, they set off a chain reaction of events that alters the political agenda and creates a new constellation of political forces. Indeed, the courts can sometimes be more than tripwires. As the political agenda has expanded, the courts have become the favorite method for effecting change for which there is no popular majority. There may be little electoral support for allowing abortion on demand, eliminating school prayer, ordering school busing, or attacking tobacco companies, but in the courts, elections do not matter. The courts are the preferred vehicles for the advocates of unpopular causes. The bureaucracy has acquired a new significance in American politics, not simply because of its size or power, but also because it is now a source of political innovation. At one time, the federal government reacted to events in society and to demands from segments of society. Ordinarily, it did not itself propose changes and new ideas. Today, the bureaucracy is so large and includes within it so great a variety of experts and advocates that it has become a source of policy proposals, as well as an implementer of those that become law. The late U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan called this the professionalization of reform, by which he meant, in part, that the government bureaucracy had begun to think up problems for government to solve, rather than simply to respond to the problems identified by others. In the 1930s, many of the key elements of the New Deal, Social Security, unemployment compensation, public housing, and old age benefits, were ideas devised by non-government experts and intellectuals here and abroad, and then, as the crisis of the Depression deepened, taken up by the federal government. In the 1960s, by contrast, most of the measures that became known as part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, federal aid to education, manpower development and training, Medicare and Medicaid, the war on poverty, the Safe Streets Act providing federal aid to local law enforcement agencies, were developed, designed, and advocated by government officials, bureaucrats, and their political allies. Chief among these political allies are U.S. senators and their staffs. Once the Senate was best described as a club that moved slowly, debated endlessly, and resisted, under the leadership of conservative Southern Democrats, the plans of liberal presidents. With the collapse of the one-party South and the increase in the number of liberal activist senators, the Senate became in the 1960s an incubator for developing new policies and building national constituencies. Media. The national press can either help place new matters on the agenda or publicize those matters placed there by others. There was a close correlation between the political action given in the Senate to proposals for new safety standards for industry, coal mines, and automobiles, and the amount of space devoted to these questions in the pages of the New York Times. Newspaper interest in the matter, low before the issue was placed on the agenda, peaked at about the time the bill was passed. It is hard, of course, to decide which is the cause and which the effect. The press may have stimulated congressional interest in the matter or merely reported on what Congress had already decided to pursue. Nonetheless, the press must choose which of thousands of proposals it will cover. The beliefs of editors and reporters led it to select the safety issue. Actions by the states. National policy is increasingly being made by the actions of state governments. You may wonder how. After all, a state can only pass laws that affect its own people. Of course, the national government may later adopt ideas pioneered in the states, as it did when Congress passed a do not call law to reduce how many phone calls you'll get from salespeople while you are trying to eat dinner. The states had taken the lead on this issue. But there is another way in which state governments can make national policy directly without Congress ever voting on the matter. The attorneys general of states may sue a business firm and settle the suit with an agreement that binds the industry throughout the country. The effect of one suit was to raise prices for consumers and create a new set of regulations. This is what happened in 1998 with a tobacco agreement negotiated between cigarette companies and some state attorneys general. The companies agreed to raise their prices, pay more than $240 billion to state governments to use as they wished, and several $billions to private lawyers, and comply with a massive regulatory program. A decade later, the federal government passed laws that reinforced the state's regulations, culminating in the Family Smoking Prevention Tobacco Control Act of 2009. The politics of different issues. Once an issue is on the political agenda, its nature affects the kind of politicking that ensues. Some issues provoke intense interest group conflict. Others allow one group to prevail almost unchallenged. Some issues involve ideological appeals to broad national constituencies. Others involve quiet bargaining in congressional offices. We all know that private groups try to influence government policies. We often forget that the nature of the issues with which government is dealing influences the kinds of groups that become politically active. One way to understand why government handles a given issue as it does is to examine what appear to be the costs and benefits of the proposed policy. The cost is any burden, monetary or non-monetary, that some people must bear, or believe they must bear, if the policy is adopted. The costs of a government spending program are the taxes it entails. The cost of a foreign policy initiative may be the increased chance of having the nation drawn into war. The benefit is any satisfaction, monetary or non-monetary, that people believe they will enjoy if the policy is adopted. The benefits of a government spending program are the payments, subsidies, or contracts received by some people. The benefits of a foreign policy initiative may include the enhanced security of the nation, the protection of a valued ally, or the vindication of some important principle, such as human rights. Two aspects of these costs and benefits should be borne in mind. First, it is the perception of costs and benefits that affects politics. People may think the cost of an auto emissions control system is paid by the manufacturer, when it is actually passed onto the consumer in the form of higher prices and reduced performance. Political conflict over pollution control will take one form when people think that the polluting industries pay the costs, and another form when they think that the consumers pay. Second, people take into account not only who benefits, but also whether it is legitimate for that group to benefit. When programs providing financial assistance to women with dependent children were first developed in the early part of the 20th century, they were relatively non-controversial, because people saw the money as going to widows and orphans who deserved such aid. Later on, giving aid to mothers with dependent children became controversial, because some people now perceived the recipients not as deserving widows, but as irresponsible women who had never married. Whatever the truth of the matter, the program had lost some of its legitimacy because the beneficiaries were no longer seen as quote-unquote deserving. By the same token, groups once thought undeserving, such as men out of work, were later thought to be entitled to aid, and thus the unemployment compensation program acquired a legitimacy that it once lacked. Politics is in large measure a process of raising and settling disputes over who will benefit or pay for a program and who ought to benefit or pay. Because beliefs about the results of a program and the rightness of those results are matters of opinion, it is evident that these ideas are at least as important as interests in shaping politics. In recent years, ideas have become especially important with the rise of issues whose consequences are largely intangible, such as abortion, school prayer, and gay rights. Though perceptions about costs and benefits change, most people, most of the time, prefer government programs that provide substantial benefits to them at low cost. This rather obvious fact can have important implications for how politics is carried out. In a political system based on some measure of popular rule, public officials have a strong incentive to offer programs that confer, or appear to confer, benefits on people with costs either small in amount, remote in time, or borne by somebody else. Policies that seem to impose high immediate costs in return for small or remote benefits will be avoided, enacted with a minimum of publicity, or proposed only in response to a real or apparent crisis. Ordinarily, no president would propose a policy that would immediately raise the cost of fuel, even if he were convinced that future supplies of oil and gasoline were likely to be exhausted unless higher prices reduced current consumption. But when a crisis occurs, such as the Arab oil cartel's price increases beginning in 1973, it becomes possible for the president to offer such proposals, as did Nixon, Ford, and Carter in varying ways. Even then, however, people are reluctant to bear increased cost, and thus many are led to dispute the president's claim that an emergency actually exists. These entirely human responses to the perceived costs and benefits of proposed policies can be organized into a simple theory of politics. It is based on the observation that the costs and benefits of a policy may be widely distributed, spread over many, most, or even all citizens, or narrowly concentrated, limited to a relatively small number of citizens or to some identifiable organized group. For instance, a widely distributed cost would include an income tax, a social security tax, or a high rate of crime. A widely distributed benefit might include retirement benefits for all citizens, clean air, national security, or low crime rates. Examples of narrowly concentrated costs include the expenditures by a factory to reduce its pollution, government regulations imposed on doctors and hospitals participating in the Medicare program, or restrictions on freedom of speech imposed on a dissident political group. Examples of narrowly concentrated benefits include subsidies to farmers or merchant ship companies, the enlarged freedom to speak and protest afforded a dissident group, or protection against competition given to an industry because of favorable government regulation. The perceived distribution of costs and benefits shapes the kinds of political coalitions that will form, but it will not necessarily determine who wins. There are 4 types of politics, and a given popular majority, interest group, client, or entrepreneur may win or lose depending on its influence and the temper of the times. 4 types of politics. Majoritarian politics, distributed benefits, distributed costs. Some policies promise benefits to large numbers of people at a cost that large numbers of people will have to bear. For example, almost everyone will sooner or later receive Social Security benefits, and almost everyone who works has to pay Social Security taxes. Such majoritarian politics are usually not dominated by pulling and hauling among rival interest groups. Instead, they involve making appeals to large segments of voters and their representatives in the hopes of finding a majority. The reason why interest groups are not so important in majoritarian politics is that citizens rarely will have much incentive to join an interest group if the policy that such a group supports will benefit everybody, whether or not they are members of the group. This is the free rider problem. Why join the committee to increase or decrease the defense budget when what you personally contribute to the committee makes little difference in the outcome, and when you will enjoy the benefits of more or less national defense even if you stayed on the sidelines? Majoritarian politics may be controversial, but the controversy is usually over matters of cost or ideology, not between rival interest groups. For example, there was intense controversy over the healthcare plan that President Obama signed into law, but the debate was not dominated by interest groups, and many different types of politics were at play. The military budget went up during the early 1980s, down in the late 1980s, up after 2001, and down again after 2010. These changes reflected different views on how much we need to spend on our military operations abroad. Interest group politics. Concentrated benefits, concentrated costs. In interest group politics, a proposed policy will confer benefits on some relatively small, identifiable group and impose costs on another small, equally identifiable group. For example, when Congress passed a bill requiring companies to give 60 days notice of a plant closing or a large-scale layoff, labor unions whose members would benefit backed the bill, and many business firms, which would pay the costs, opposed it. Issues of this kind tend to be fought out by organized interest groups. Each side will be so powerfully affected by the outcome that it has a strong incentive to mobilize. Union members who worry about layoffs will have a personal stake in favoring the notice bill. Business leaders who fear government control of investment decisions will have an economic stake in opposing it. Interest group politics often produces decisions about which the public is uninformed. For instance, there have been bitter debates between television broadcasters and cable companies over who may send what kind of signals to which homes. But these debates hardly draw any public notice until after a law is passed and people see their increased cable charges. Though many issues of this type involve monetary costs and benefits, they can also involve intangible considerations. If the American Nazi Party wants to march through a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, carrying flags with swastikas on them, the community may organize itself to resist out of revulsion due to the horrific treatment of Jews by Nazi Germany. Each side may hire lawyers to debate the issue before the city council and in the courts. Client politics. Concentrated benefits, distributed cost. With client politics, some identifiable, often small group will benefit, but everybody, or at least a large part of society, will pay the costs. Because the benefits are concentrated, the groups to receive those benefits has an incentive to organize and work to get them. But because the costs are widely distributed, affecting many people only slightly, those who pay the costs may be either unaware of any costs or indifferent to them, because per capita, they are so small. This situation gives rise to client politics, sometimes called clientele politics. The beneficiary of the policy is the quote-unquote client of the government. For example, many farmers benefit substantially from agricultural price supports, but the far more numerous food consumers have no idea what these price supports cost them in taxes and higher food prices. Similarly, for some time, airlines benefited from the higher prices they were able to charge on certain routes as a result of government regulations that restricted competition over prices. But the average passenger was either unaware that their costs were higher or did not think the higher prices were worth making a fuss about. Not all clients have economic interests. Localities can also benefit as clients when, for example, a city or county obtains a new dam, a better harbor, or an improved irrigation system. Some of these projects may be worthwhile, others may not. By custom, however, they are usually referred to as pork barrel projects. Usually, several pieces of pork are put into one barrel. That is, several projects are approved in a single piece of pork barrel legislation, such as the Rivers and Harbors Bill that Congress passes almost every year. Trading votes in this way attracts the support of members of Congress from each affected area. With enough projects, a majority coalition is formed. This process is called log rolling. Not every group that wants something from government at little cost to the average citizen will get it. Welfare recipients cost the typical taxpayer a small amount each year, yet there was great resistance to increasing these benefits. The homeless have not organized themselves to get benefits. Indeed, most do not even vote. Yet benefits are being provided, albeit in modest amounts. These examples illustrate the importance of popular views concerning the legitimacy of client claims as a factor in determining the success of client demands. By the same token, groups can lose legitimacy that they once had. People who grew tobacco once were supported simply because they were farmers, and were thus seen as both deserving and politically important. But when people began worrying about the health risks associated with using tobacco, farmers who produced tobacco lost some legitimacy compared to those who produce corn or cotton. As a result, it became harder to get votes for maintaining tobacco price supports, and easier to slap higher taxes on cigarettes. Entrepreneurial politics: distributed benefits, concentrated costs. In entrepreneurial politics, society as a whole, or some large part of it, benefits from a policy that imposes substantial costs on some small, identifiable segment of society. The anti-pollution and safety requirements for automobiles were proposed as ways of improving the health and well-being of all people at the expense, at least initially, of automobile manufacturers. It is remarkable that policies of this sort are ever adopted, and in fact, many are not. After all, the American political system creates many opportunities for checking and blocking the actions of others. The founders deliberately arranged things so that it would be difficult to pass a new law. A determined minority, therefore, has an excellent chance of blocking a new policy. And any organized group that fears the loss of some privilege or the imposition of some burden will become a very determined minority indeed. The opponent has every incentive to work hard. The large group of prospective beneficiaries may be unconvinced of the benefit, or regarded as too small to be worth fighting for. Nonetheless, policies with distributed benefits and concentrated costs are in fact adopted, and in recent decades they have been adopted with increasing frequency. A key element in the adoption of such policies has been the work of people who act on behalf of the unorganized or indifferent majority. Such people, called policy entrepreneurs, are those both in and out of government who find ways of pulling together a legislative majority on behalf of interests that are not well represented in the government. These policy entrepreneurs may or may not represent the interests and wishes of the public at large, but they do have the ability to dramatize an issue in a convincing manner. Ralph Nader is perhaps the best known example of a policy entrepreneur, or as he might describe himself, a, quote, consumer advocate. But there are other examples from both ends of the political spectrum, conservative as well as liberal. Entrepreneurial politics can occur without the leadership of a policy entrepreneur if voters or legislators in large numbers suddenly become disgruntled by the high cost of some benefit that a group is receiving, or become convinced of the urgent need for a new policy to impose such costs. For example, voters may not care about government programs that benefit the oil industry when gasoline costs only $1 a gallon, but they might care very much when the price rises to $3 a gallon, even if the government benefits had nothing to do with the price increase. By the same token, legislators may not worry much about the effects of smog in the air until a lot of people develop burning eyes and running noses during an especially severe smog attack. In fact, most legislators did not worry very much about toxic or hazardous wastes until 1977, when the Love Canal dump site near Buffalo, New York, spilled some of its toxic waste into the backyards of an adjacent residential neighborhood, and people were forced to leave their homes. 5 years later, anyone who had forgotten about the Love Canal was reminded of it when the town of Times Beach, Missouri, had to be permanently evacuated because it had become contaminated with the chemical dioxin. Only then did it become widely known that there were more than 30,000 toxic waste sites nationwide that posed public safety risks. The Superfund program was born in 1980 of the political pressure that developed in the wake of these and other highly publicized tales of toxic waste dangers. Superfund was intended to force industries to clean up their own toxic waste sites. It also authorized the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, to act speedily, with or without cooperation from other industries, in identifying and cleaning up any sites that posed a large or imminent danger. Superfund suffered a number of political and administrative problems, and only a few of the 1,300 sites initially targeted by the EPA had been cleaned up a dozen years after the program went into effect. Regardless, Superfund is a good illustration of entrepreneurial politics in action. Special taxes on once largely unregulated oil and chemical companies funded the program. These companies once enjoyed special tax breaks, but as the politics of the issue changed, they were forced to shoulder special tax burdens. In effect, the politics of the issue changed from client politics to entrepreneurial politics. Policy dynamics, inside and outside the box. Superfund also thereby illustrates how dynamic the politics of policymaking can be. Once an issue makes its way onto the political agenda, the politics of the issue can remain stable, change a little or a lot, and change very slowly or quite suddenly. And policy issues can migrate from one type of politics, and one of the four boxes, to another. By the same token, the policy dynamics of some issues are simply harder to categorize and explain than the policy dynamics of others. For instance, in the mid-2000s, 13 states amended their state constitutions to prohibit or further restrict gay marriage. In 2008, California voters approved a ballot measure, Proposition 8, banning gay marriage. But virtually all of these policies were enacted at a time when popular support for gay rights, including same-sex marriage, was rising. In 2001, by a margin of 57% to 35%, Americans opposed gay marriage, but by 2013, a 49% to 44% plurality favored gay marriage. In 2012, President Barack Obama, having previously ordered an end to the ban on gays in the U.S. military, publicly declared his support for legalizing same-sex marriage. Surveys indicated that the only groups still harboring wide majorities opposed to same-sex marriage were evangelical Christians and adults born in 1964 or earlier. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a 1996 federal law that allowed the federal government to discriminate against same-sex married couples, but did not strike down the state laws banning same-sex marriage. So, how best can we categorize or explain the politics of this issue? Which type of politics, majoritarian, client, interest group, or entrepreneurial, were most important to policymaking? Why did state laws become more restrictive at the very time that both mass public opinion and elite opinion were trending towards greater acceptance? Do the still unfolding policy dynamics of this issue fit neatly or fit at all in any of our four boxes? Start thinking about these questions. We will revisit them in Chapter 6. Finally, while the politics of some issues does fit neatly into one box or another, the politics of other issues reflect several different types of politics. For example, most major pieces of social legislation reflect majoritarian politics. Social Security remains a prime example, but the politics of healthcare issues has often played out within all four boxes: majoritarian, client, interest group, and entrepreneurial at once. This was certainly true in the politics of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, better known as Obamacare. As we illustrate nearby in our first Policy Dynamics Inside and Outside the Box feature, the perceived costs and benefits of the Obama plan affected the political coalitions that formed around it, and involved all four types of politics. Policy Dynamics Inside and Outside the Box. Obamacare. All four boxes? When Medicare was enacted in 1965, Democrats in the House and Senate voted for it by a wide margin, but roughly half of the Republicans in each chamber also supported it. But the 2010 healthcare bill was passed without any Republican support. In other words, the 1965 Medicare bill that President Johnson signed into law had broad bipartisan backing, but the 2010 healthcare bill that President Obama signed into law had none. Using the model of the policy process explained in this chapter, here is a summary of how the costs and benefits of the Obama plan affected the political coalitions that formed around healthcare. Majoritarian politics. The bill was opposed by a majority of Americans for a variety of reasons. Many thought it too expensive, $940 billion over 10 years, or worried about the government regulations that the law contained. Client politics. Drug manufacturers looked forward to having many new customers as more people owned health insurance. To get this benefit, the pharmaceutical companies agreed to pay up to $85 billion in higher taxes. Many hospitals thought that they would be helped by having more patients who could pay their bills with health insurance. Interest group politics. Labor unions wanted health care coverage, but business firms were upset by the higher taxes and fees they would have to pay. Poorer people liked it, but those earning $200,000 a year or more would see their taxes escalate. Elderly people on Medicare and many doctors worried that the new law promised to cut payments to physicians. But the American Medical Association and the AARP, the largest organization representing senior citizens, endorsed the law. Policy entrepreneurs. In early 2010, the winners were President Obama and the Democratic leaders in the House who got a bill passed over popular and interest group opposition. In the latter half of 2010, however, the winners were the Republicans who opposed Obamacare and used the issue on the way to sweeping GOP victories in the November 2010 elections. When the 112th Congress was seated in 2011, Republicans in the House made good on a pledge to vote for the outright repeal of the new law. The symbolic bill died in the Senate, and several states' attorneys general challenged the law's constitutionality in the federal courts, focusing mainly on the provision mandating that individuals purchase health insurance. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the law's individual mandate, but ruled against certain other provisions of the law, including ones pertaining to changes in the federal-state program known as Medicaid, a program that was created in 1965 alongside Medicare. The Medicare law and the new healthcare law mobilized very different coalitions in part because, between 1965 and 2010, Congress became a far more polarized institution. The Obamacare policy was based on a combination of majoritarian, client, interest group, and entrepreneurial politics. The politics of the issue was neither inside nor outside any one of the four boxes, but spread across all four. Understanding politics. Whether pondering one's own positions on given issues, attempting to generalize about the politics of different policy issues, or tackling questions about American government, institutions, and policies, an astute student will soon come to know what Aristotle meant when he wrote that it is, quote, the mark of the educated person to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. Ideally, political scientists ought to be able to give clear answers, amply supported by evidence, to the questions that we have posed about American democracy, starting with who governs. In reality, they can, at best, give partial, contingent, and controversial answers. The reason is to be found in the nature of our subject. Unlike economists, who assume that people have, more or less, stable preferences and can compare ways of satisfying those preferences by looking at the relative prices of various goods and services, political scientists are interested in how preferences are formed, especially for those kinds of services, such as national defense or pollution control, that cannot be evaluated chiefly in terms of monetary costs. Understanding preferences is vital to understanding power. Who did what in government is not hard to find out, but who wielded power, that is, who made a difference in the outcome and for what reason, is much harder to discover. Power is a word that conjures up images of deals, bribes, power plays, and arm twisting. In fact, most power exists because of shared understanding, common friendship, communal or organizational loyalties, and different degrees of prestige. These are hard to identify and almost impossible to quantify. Nor can the distribution of political power be inferred simply by knowing what laws are on the books or what administrative actions have been taken. The enactment of a consumer protection law does not mean that consumers are powerful any more than the absence of such a law means that corporations are powerful. The passage of such a law could reflect an aroused public opinion, the lobbying of a small group claiming to speak for consumers, the ambitions of a senator, or the intrigues of one business firm seeking to gain a competitive advantage over another. A close analysis of what the law entails and how it was passed and administered is necessary before much of anything can be concluded. This book will avoid sweeping claims that we have a quote-unquote imperial presidency, or an impotent one, an quote-unquote obstructionist Congress, or an innovative one, or quote-unquote captured regulatory agencies. Such labels do an injustice to the different roles that presidents, members of Congress, and administrators play in different kinds of issues and in different historical periods. The view taken in this book is that judgments about institutions and interests can be made only after one has seen how they behave on a variety of important issues or potential issues, such as economic policy, the regulation of business, social welfare, civil rights and liberties, and foreign and military affairs. The policies adopted or blocked, the groups heeded or ignored, the values embraced or rejected, these constitute the raw material out of which one can fashion an answer to the central questions we have asked. who governs, and to what ends. The way in which our institutions of government handle social welfare, for example, differs from the way other democratic nations handle it, and it differs as well from the way our own institutions once treated it. The description of our institutions in Part 3 will therefore include not only an account of how they work today, but also a brief historical background on their workings as a comparison with similar institutions in other countries. There is a tendency to assume that how we do things today is the only way they could possibly be done. In fact, there are other ways to operate a government based on some measure of popular rule. History, tradition, and belief weigh heavily on all that we do. Although political change is not always accompanied by changes in public law, the policy process is arguably one of the best barometers of changes in who governs. Our way of classifying and explaining the politics of different policy issues has been developed, refined, and tested over more than 2 decades, longer than most of our readers have been alive. Our own students and others have valued it mainly because they have found it helps to answer such questions about who governs. How do political issues get on the public agenda in the first place? How, for example, did sexual harassment, which was hardly ever discussed or debated by Congress, burst onto the public agenda? Once on the agenda, how does the politics of issues like income security for older Americans, for example, the politics of Social Security, a program that has been on the federal books since 1935, change over time? And if today one cares about expanding civil liberties or protecting civil rights, what political obstacles and opportunities will one likely face? And what role will public opinion, organized interest groups, the media, the courts, political parties, and other institutions likely play in frustrating or fostering one's political policy preferences, whatever they might be? Peek ahead if you wish, but understand that the place to begin a search for how power is distributed in national politics and what purposes that power serves is with the founding of the federal government in 1787, the Constitutional Convention, and the events leading up to it. Though the decisions of that time were not made by philosophers or professors, the practical men who made them had a philosophic and professorial cast of mind, and thus they left behind a fairly explicit amount of what values they sought to protect and what arrangements they thought ought to be made for the allocation of political power. What would you do? Memorandum to Governor Stephen Fenore from Edmund Herron, Chief Policy Advisor. Subject, Initiative Repeal. You have supported several successful initiatives. Life imprisonment for thrice convicted violent felons, property tax limits, but you have never publicly stated a view on the initiative itself. And the repeal proposal will probably surface during tomorrow's press briefing. News. Legal and policy experts call for a ban on ballot initiatives. A report released yesterday and signed by more than 100 law and public policy professors statewide urges that the state's constitution be amended to ban legislation by initiative. The initiative allows state voters to place legislative measures directly on the ballot by getting enough signatures. The initiative, quote, has led to disastrous policy decisions on taxes, crime, and other issues, the report declared. Arguments for a ban. 1. Ours is a representative, not a direct, democracy, in which voters elect leaders and elected leaders make policy decisions subject to review by the courts. 2. Voters often are neither rational nor respectful of constitutional rights. For example, many people demand both lower taxes and more government services, and polls find that most voters would prohibit people with certain views from speaking and deprive all persons accused of a violent crime from getting out on bail while awaiting trial. 3. Over the past 100 years, hundreds of statewide ballot initiatives have been passed in 24 states. Rather than giving power to the people, special interest groups have spent billions of dollars manipulating voters to pass initiatives that enrich or benefit them, not the public at large. Arguments against a ban. 1. When elected officials fail to respond to persistent public majorities favoring tougher crime measures, lower property taxes, and other popular concerns, direct democracy via the initiative is legitimate, and the courts can still review the law. 2. More Americans than ever have college degrees and easy access to information about public affairs. Studies find that most average citizens are able to figure out which candidates, parties, or advocacy groups come closest to supporting their own economic interests and personal values. 3. All told, the 24 states that passed laws by initiative also passed thousands more laws by the regular legislative process, out of tens of thousands of bills they considered. Studies find that special interest groups are severely limited in their ability to pass new laws by initiative, while citizens groups with broad-based public support are behind most initiatives that pass. Learning objectives. 1. What is politics? Politics is the activity by which an issue is agitated or settled. Politics occurs because people disagree and the disagreement must be managed. Disagreements over many political issues, including disputes over government budgets and finances, are often at their essence disagreements over what government should or should not do at all. 2. Can you give 2 definitions of democracy? Democracy can mean either that everyone votes on all government issues, i.e. direct or participatory democracy, or that the people elect representatives to make most of these decisions, i.e. representative democracy. 3. How is political power actually distributed in America? Some people believe that political power in America is monopolized by wealthy business leaders, by other powerful elites, or by entrenched government bureaucrats. Others believe that political resources such as money, prestige, expertise, organizational position, and access to the mass media are so widely dispersed in American society, and the governmental institutions and offices in which power may be exercised so numerous and varied, that no single group truly has all or most political power. In this view, political power in America is distributed more or less widely. Still, others suggest that morally impassioned leaders have at times been deeply influential in our politics. No one, however, argues that political resources are distributed equally in America. 4. What is the political agenda, and why has it expanded? The political agenda consists of those issues that people believe require government action. The behavior of groups, the workings of institutions, the media, and the actions of state governments have all figured in the expansion of America's political agenda. The great shifts in the character of American government, its size, scope, institutional arrangements, and the direction of its policies have reflected complex and sometimes sudden changes in elite or mass beliefs about what government is supposed to do. The federal government now has policies on street crime, the environment, homeland security, and many other issues that were not on the federal agenda a half-century, or in the case of homeland security, just 15 years ago. 5. How can you classify and explain the politics of different issues? One way to classify and explain politics of different issues is in relation to the perceived costs and benefits of given policies and how narrowly concentrated, i.e., limited to a relatively small number of identifiable citizens, or widely distributed, i.e., spread over many, most, or all citizens, their perceived costs and benefits are. This approach gives us 4 types of politics: majoritarian, meaning widely distributed costs and benefits; interest group, meaning narrowly concentrated costs and benefits; client, meaning widely distributed costs and narrowly concentrated benefits; and entrepreneurial, meaning narrowly concentrated costs and widely distributed benefits. Different types of coalitions are associated with each type of politics. Issues can sometimes migrate from one type of politics to another. Some policy dynamics involve more than one type of politics, and the politics of some issues is harder to classify and explain than the politics of others. This has been American Government, Institutions and Policies, Chapter 1, The Study of American Government. I've been Valerie, and cheers.